My darlings, I see you, all of you, 12 signs, and tonight I want to talk about money in a way I have not quite talked about it with you before, because there is a specific kind of wealth that does not arrive the way most people assume wealth arrives, and 5 signs tonight are standing unusually close to it. I want to be careful from the very first sentence, because I always am on this subject. I am not going to promise you a windfall. I do not know that one is coming, nobody does, and I am not a financial advisor, and nothing tonight is financial advice. What I can show you is a structure, real and permanent in every chart, that describes a very particular kind of wealth, and it is not the kind most horoscopes talk about. Most money readings, including one I have given before on this channel, talk about your second house. Your second house is what you personally earn. Your rate, your salary, your own resources, built by your own 2 hands, alone. That is real, and it matters enormously, and it is not what tonight is about. Tonight I want to show you the 8th house. The 8th house is not solo. It has never been solo, in any chart, for any person who has ever lived. It is the house of what happens when your resources meet somebody else's, or something else's, and the 2 of them do not simply sit side by side. They merge, and something new and considerably larger than either half comes out the other side of that merging. An inheritance, a marriage of finances as much as of hearts, a business partnership, an investment that matures into something none of the original contributors could have produced alone. A debt, cleared, that frees an entirely different scale of life underneath it. That is what a richest era actually is, for the 5 signs I am giving you tonight. Not a bigger number arriving in the account you already have. A merger. 2 separate, smaller things becoming one larger thing that did not exist in either of them before. Let me give you the plainest possible version of the difference, because I want you to be able to tell, in your own life, which kind of wealth you are actually looking at. A second house improvement changes the number. The account is still entirely, exclusively yours, and it simply has more in it than it did before, through your own continued effort. An 8th house merger changes the ownership itself. There is no longer a single, clean line marking where your resources end and somebody else's begin, because the 2 have become one structure, and that structure did not exist, in that form, before the merging happened. One is arithmetic performed on a number you already had. The other is chemistry. 2 separate substances combining into a third that behaves nothing like either original ingredient. And I want to tell you something honest before I give you the 5, because I think it is the single most important thing in this entire reading, and I do not want to bury it at the end where you might miss it. A merger requires an ending first, always. 2 things cannot become one larger thing while both are still fully, separately, exactly what they were. Something about the smaller, solo version of you has to conclude before the larger, merged version can exist. And I am not going to pretend that conclusion is always comfortable, or that it always looks, in the moment, like good news. I think this is precisely why so many people miss their own 8th house opportunities entirely, my darlings. And it is worth saying plainly before we go any further. They arrive dressed as a problem to be solved, rather than a door to walk through, and a mind looking for wealth to arrive as unambiguous good fortune will very often fail to recognize the actual invitation standing in front of it, because the invitation, at first glance, looks like a loss. The 5 signs are Taurus, Scorpio, Capricorn, Virgo, and Leo, and I am going to tell you, for each one, precisely what has to end before the merging can happen, because I think that is more useful to you than any promise of the number on the other side of it. I will say now what to listen for. At the end of every section tonight, I tell you the specific ending each sign has to allow. 5 different endings, and by the time I reach the last one, I think the pattern underneath all 5 is going to become impossible to miss. I am Madame Aurora, 35 years studying the stars from my office in Manhattan, and there are no cards tonight, and I want to tell you why, briefly, before we begin. A merger is not an atmosphere. It is a structure, 2 parties and an agreement, and I would rather give you the structure plainly than dress it up in a spread that suggests there is something mysterious about it. There isn't. There is only the 8th house, and what it asks of each of you. Now let us begin. Let us go to Taurus. My darling Taurus, your 8th house is Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, the planet of expansion, and I want you to notice immediately how strange that pairing is, because it is the strangest of all 5 tonight. Your own sign is ruled by Venus, and Venus values what is known, tangible, and already proven safe. You are, of all 12 signs, the one most instinctively drawn to the sure thing, the resource you can see, hold, and verify with your own hands. That instinct has served you extraordinarily well across an ordinary life, and I am not here to tell you it is wrong. But your richest era does not live in the sure thing, my darling. It lives in Jupiter, which has never once in the whole of astrology stood for the safe, the small, or the fully verified in advance. Jupiter expands. It takes a reasonable, contained thing and makes it considerably larger, and it does that specifically by moving into territory that was not yet proven safe at the moment you moved into it. So for you, the merger arrives through actual risk, not recklessness, and I am not asking you to abandon your excellent judgment about value, but a genuine opportunity to combine what you have with something larger, further away, less immediately verifiable than anything you have said yes to before. A partner's resources joining yours in a venture that has not yet proven itself. An investment in something you cannot personally inspect and hold in your hands. An inheritance or an opportunity that requires you to trust a process happening somewhere you cannot watch it directly. What has to end for you, my darling, is the belief that safety only exists in what is already contained and known. That belief has protected you well. It is also the exact wall standing between you and the one house in your chart built entirely out of expansion. I want to add one practical note, because your sign will otherwise hear all of this as an instruction to abandon caution entirely, and that is not what I am asking of you. Jupiter does not want your judgment removed from the equation. It wants your judgment applied to something larger than you have been willing to apply it to before. Keep your excellent instinct for genuine value. Simply stop requiring the thing you are evaluating to already be fully proven before you are willing to look at it seriously. Taurus, the ending is the small, safe container. The merger is what happens once you are finally willing to let it be too small to hold what is actually available to you. Now let me speak to Scorpio, and I want to tell you something first that I think you will find rather satisfying, because it is a small, precise piece of astrology that belongs to your sign alone tonight. Every chart, of any sign, has an 8th house. But your sign is the one that rules the 8th house naturally, in the wheel of the zodiac itself, before any individual chart is ever drawn. Transformation, shared resources, what merges and what ends, all of it has been your territory since before astrology gave any of the other 11 signs a claim to it. And I want you to notice what happens when we ask what governs your own 8th house specifically, counted from your own sign the way I count it for everyone tonight. It is Gemini, ruled by Mercury. My darling, that is not a small detail. You, the sign that owns transformation itself, find your own personal richest era, governed not by depth, not by secrecy, not by the intensity your sign is famous for, but by Mercury, by words, by an agreement written down, a conversation had directly, a contract signed rather than merely understood, between two people who trust each other enough not to need one. I think that is the most important sentence I will say to you all night, because your sign's instinct, faced with anything valuable, is to hold it privately, to trust the unspoken understanding over the explicit one, to let intensity and loyalty stand in for the paperwork. And your own 8th house is telling you, plainly, that the merger you are actually waiting for does not complete on trust alone. It completes on Mercury, on the thing said plainly and then written down. For some of you, this is a business arrangement that has been running on an unspoken understanding for years, which needs, finally, an actual document behind it before it can grow into what it is capable of becoming. For some, it is an inheritance or a shared resource where the family has been avoiding the direct conversation, assuming everyone understands the arrangement the same way, and where a plain, specific conversation would reveal that they do not. For some, it is simply permission to ask, in words, for the specific figure or the specific terms you have been leaving to unspoken good faith. What has to end for you, my darling, is the belief that saying the arrangement out loud, in plain language, cheapens it, or exposes it, or invites a kind of scrutiny your sign instinctively recoils from. I want to be direct about why this particular ending is harder for you than for almost anyone else tonight. Your sign associates unspoken understanding with intimacy itself. Two people who do not need to say it, who simply know, are, in your private accounting, closer than two people who require the words spelled out. So asking you to put the arrangement into plain language can feel, to you specifically, like a demotion of the relationship rather than a protection of it, when it is almost always the opposite. Words do not replace the trust, my darling. They simply give the trust something solid enough to actually hold weight when it eventually needs to. Scorpio, the ending is the unspoken understanding. The merger is what happens once you are willing to let Mercury do what depth alone was never going to finish. Now, before I go to Capricorn, let me pause for a moment. If what I have said so far is landing, tap that little like button below this video. It is a small gesture, and it does something real, which is tell YouTube to carry this to somebody who has been trusting an unspoken arrangement for considerably longer than she should have. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment, because 3 signs remain, and the pattern underneath all 5 is only going to get clearer. Now let me speak to Capricorn. My darling Capricorn, your 8th house is Leo, ruled by the sun, and I want to be honest with you immediately, because this is going to ask something of you that runs directly against your entire strategy for how a person accumulates real, lasting resources. Your own sign is ruled by Saturn, and Saturn builds quietly, methodically, over time, largely uninterested in whether anyone is watching the construction. You have never needed an audience to know that what you built was solid, and that has made you the most reliable sign in the zodiac, the one still standing at the end of things everyone else abandoned. But your richest era does not live in Saturn's quiet construction, my darling. It lives in the sun, which has never once, in the whole history of this practice, stood for the private or the unseen. The sun is the one body in the entire chart that does not orbit anything. It is the center. It is looked at, by definition, by everything else in the sky. So for you, the merger requires visibility, not performance, and not the kind of self-promotion your sign finds genuinely distasteful, but a willingness to be known, personally, by name, as the person behind the structure, rather than letting the structure itself stand quietly in for you while you remain, as you have always preferred, somewhere just out of frame. For some of you, this is a partnership or an investment that will only come to you once the right people actually know who you are, rather than only knowing the work. For some, it is stepping, finally, into the visible leadership of something you have been quietly running from behind for years. For some, it is simply allowing your own name to be attached to an achievement you would ordinarily let stay anonymous or shared. What has to end for you, my darling, is the belief that being seen is a kind of vanity, or a risk, or simply unnecessary if the work is good enough to speak for itself. Capricorn, the ending is the comfortable invisibility. The merger is what happens once you let the sun do what quiet, solitary building was never, on its own, going to finish. Now let me speak to Virgo. My darling Virgo, your 8th house is Aries, ruled by Mars, and I think this one is going to land the hardest of tonight's 5, because it asks you to act before you are ready, and I do not believe there is a sentence in the English language your sign finds more uncomfortable than that one. Your own nature is careful. You check the figures twice. You wait until the plan is complete, the risks accounted for, the details verified, before you commit to anything at all, and that carefulness has saved you from a great many mistakes that other signs walked directly into. But your richest era does not live in careful completeness, my darling. It lives in Mars, which has never once stood for the fully prepared. Mars moves first and lets the plan finish forming in motion. It is the planet of the decisive first step taken while the picture is still incomplete, not out of recklessness, but because some doors are only open to the person who walks through them before every variable has been resolved. So for you, the merger requires initiating something before you have done your usual full accounting of it. A partnership offer said yes to before you have modeled every possible outcome. A resource combined with somebody else's on the strength of a genuinely good instinct rather than a complete spreadsheet. An opportunity that will simply not wait for the version of readiness you have always required of yourself before. For some of you, this is a business opportunity with a real deadline attached. One that will go to somebody else entirely if you spend the usual number of weeks verifying it first. For some, it is a financial merger with a partner that requires you to commit before every contingency has been discussed and resolved. For some, it is simply making the first offer, first, rather than waiting to respond to somebody else's. What has to end for you, my darling, is the belief that acting before the plan is complete is the same thing as acting carelessly. It is not the same thing, and your own 8th house is telling you so directly. Here is the distinction I would ask you to hold, because your sign will otherwise hear this as permission to abandon diligence altogether, and that has never been the request. Mars does not ask you to stop analyzing, it asks you to stop requiring the analysis to be finished before you commit. Say yes, sign the agreement, take the meeting, and continue refining the details in motion, the way a great many perfectly sound arrangements are actually built in practice, rather than waiting at the starting line until every variable has been resolved on paper first, which is a standard almost nothing in real financial life has ever actually met. Virgo. The ending is the completed plan you have always waited for before moving. The merger is what happens once you let Mars take the first step while you are still finishing the analysis behind it. Now let me speak to Leo, and I have saved you for last, because your 8th house asks something of you that is, I think, the most difficult of tonight's 5, precisely because it asks you to release the one thing your sign has never fully released for anybody. My darling Leo, your 8th house is Pisces, ruled by Jupiter in the old tradition and by Neptune in the modern one, and both of them, in their own way, describe the same thing: dissolution, surrender, the letting go of a boundary that used to separate what was yours from what belonged to somebody or something else. Your own sign is ruled by the sun, and the sun does not dissolve into anything. It is the center, radiant and singular, and everything else in the chart is measured against it rather than the other way around. You have built a great deal of your life on being, unmistakably, the source, the one others orbit rather than the one who orbits. Your richest era does not live in that singularity, my darling. It lives in Neptune, which has never once stood for control, clarity, or a single identifiable source. It stands for merging so complete that the edges between what was yours and what was somebody else's genuinely blur, and for trusting a process you cannot fully see, direct, or take personal credit for while it is happening. For some of you, this is a shared financial future with a partner that requires you to actually relinquish some control over decisions you have always made unilaterally. For some, it is an investment, an inheritance, or a business arrangement that only works if you can tolerate not being the visible, singular architect of the outcome. For some, it is simply trusting somebody else's competence with resources you have always insisted on personally overseeing. What has to end for you, my darling, is the need to be the identifiable, singular source of your own good fortune. I want to say the gentlest possible version of this, because I know it touches something old in your sign, close to a fear of being replaceable if you are no longer the only one who can be credited. That fear is not irrational, my darling, and I would not dismiss it. But dissolving the edge around what is yours is not the same as disappearing behind it. The sun does not stop being the sun when its light reaches a room it did not build. It simply illuminates something larger than itself, and is not, in the process, diminished by so much as a single degree. Leo, the ending is the requirement that it be visibly, unmistakably yours alone. The merger is what happens once you let something dissolve the edge between what you built and what somebody else is bringing to it, and discover, on the other side of that dissolving, that you have not actually disappeared. Now, my darlings, let me speak to the 7 signs I have not named tonight, because every chart has an 8th house, and I do not believe in a reading that gives 5 of you the whole of my attention and leaves everybody else standing outside. Aries, your 8th house is Scorpio itself, the purest and most intense version of this house that exists, ruled by Mars and, in the modern tradition, by Pluto as well. Your merger, when it comes, is total rather than partial, and it will ask you to release something completely, rather than in careful stages, which is, in its own way, considerably easier for your sign than a slow negotiation would be. Gemini, your 8th house is Capricorn, ruled by Saturn. Your merger requires patience and structure, a genuine willingness to let something build slowly over years rather than arrive all at once, which will test your sign's usual preference for the quick and the immediate, more than almost anything else in this reading could. Cancer, your 8th house is Aquarius, ruled by Saturn in the old tradition and Uranus in the new. Your merger arrives through a group, a network, or a community rather than through one intimate connection, which asks your deeply private sign to let its resources become entangled with people considerably further from your inner circle than you would ordinarily allow. Libra, your 8th house is Taurus, ruled by Venus, your own ruler, which makes this one of the gentler placements tonight. Your merger favors patience and the slow accumulation of tangible, verifiable value, and it asks mainly that you trust your own excellent judgment about worth, rather than deferring it, as you so often do, to somebody else's opinion. Sagittarius, your 8th house is Cancer, ruled by the moon. Your merger requires emotional vulnerability, rather than the philosophical distance your sign usually prefers, a willingness to let a financial matter be genuinely felt, rather than simply understood and explained. Aquarius, your 8th house is Virgo, ruled by Mercury. Your merger requires unglamorous, detailed attention, actual paperwork, and actual follow-through, which will test a sign that is considerably more comfortable with the large idea than with the small, precise mechanics of executing it. And Pisces, your 8th house is Libra, ruled by Venus. Your merger requires a genuine, formalized partnership, an actual agreement between two parties, rather than the diffuse, boundary-blurred arrangements your sign sometimes prefers, and it asks you to define, clearly, what belongs to whom, even as the two of you combine it. Every one of you receives this somewhere, my darlings, whether or not your sign was one of tonight's 5. Now, before I go further, do something with me. It takes 20 seconds and it works whatever your sign. Think of the resource. Whatever your richest era is likely to involve, for you specifically, based on what I have just described. Now think of the ending attached to it, the small, safe container, the unspoken understanding, the comfortable invisibility, the completed plan you always wait for. The need to be the singular, visible source. Which one is yours? You will know within a few seconds, because your sign always knows, underneath the noise, exactly what it is being asked to release. Hold your answer. I am going to come back to it. Now I want to speak honestly about the ending itself, because I promised you at the very beginning that I would not treat it lightly, and I meant that. The 8th house is not only money, my darlings. In its oldest, deepest astrological meaning, it is the house of death and of what comes after it, and I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because I think it explains something true about why this particular kind of wealth so often arrives disguised, at first, as loss. Some of you, hearing tonight's reading, are going to receive your merger through an inheritance, and an inheritance requires that somebody you loved is no longer here to have given it to you directly. I am not going to describe that as good news dressed up as bad news. It is genuinely both at once, sorrow and provision arriving in the same envelope, and I would never ask you to feel simply grateful about it. Grieve the person completely, my darling, exactly as much as the loss deserves. The fact that something material follows a death does not obligate you to feel resolved about the death itself, and anybody who tells you it should has not sat with enough real grief to know better. For others, the ending is smaller and considerably less final, and I do not want the weight of the paragraph I have just given you to make every one of tonight's endings sound like a death. Most of them are not. Most of them are the quieter kind, a belief given up, a habit released, a version of yourself that served you well for a long time and simply is not built for what is coming next. That kind of ending deserves its own grief too, in a smaller register, and your sign, I have noticed, is very often reluctant to grant itself permission to mourn something that was not, technically, a person. Whatever your particular ending turns out to be, my darling, I would ask only this. Let it be an ending before you rush it into becoming a lesson, or a silver lining, or a tidy story about growth. It is allowed to simply be a loss, for as long as it needs to be one, before it becomes anything else. Let me speak briefly to where this merger tends to actually arrive, because the 8th house shows up differently depending on which corner of your life it enters through, and I do not want you watching only one door for it. In marriage or long partnership, this is the most literal and the most common form, and it is also the one your sign is most likely to have already half completed without fully examining it. A shared account, a joint decision about a major purchase, a will finally being written properly after years of both of you meaning to. Notice whether the ending I described for your sign has already been quietly happening inside that partnership, unnamed. In business, this arrives as the kind of arrangement Henrietta lived through, an acquisition, a genuine partnership rather than simply hired help, equity rather than salary. The tell is usually a proposal that asks for more of you personally than a normal transaction would. which is precisely why your sign is inclined to hesitate over exactly the offers most worth taking seriously. In inheritance and family resources, which carries the heaviest version of the ending I described a few minutes ago, and which deserves to be approached slowly, without pressure, and, where it is available to you, with real professional guidance rather than only an astrologer's framework. And in investment, in the broadest sense of the word, money placed somewhere you do not personally control day to day, trusting a process, a person, or an institution to do something with your resources that you could not do alone. This is the gentlest entry point for several of tonight's 5, and very often the one your sign considers seriously only after all the more personal versions have already asked something of you first. Let me tell you about Henrietta, because I think her story will make the whole of this considerably more useful to you than the astrology alone can manage. Henrietta was a Capricorn client of mine, born in early January, who came to me in her early 60s, some years into what she described, with a certain dry humor, as a perfectly adequate retirement. She had spent 31 years building a small, specialized consultancy, the kind of business that runs quietly and profitably for decades, without ever once appearing in anybody's newspaper. And she had done the entire thing, by her own account, almost anonymously. Clients knew her firm. Almost none of them, she told me, could have picked her out of a room, and she had always considered that arrangement not merely acceptable but actively preferable. The work spoke. She did not need to. A larger company approached her, the year before she came to me, wanting to acquire the consultancy outright. The number was, by her own description, extremely good, and there was a condition attached to it that she found, initially, close to unbearable. For the acquisition to make sense to their own investors, they wanted her, personally, publicly, as the visible face of the transition. Interviews. A public announcement with her name and her photograph attached to it. Roughly 18 months of being, for the first time in 31 years, genuinely known rather than quietly effective. She very nearly declined the entire arrangement over that single condition. She said to me, "In our first session, I have spent 3 decades making sure the work was the story. I do not know how to be the story myself, and I am not sure I want to learn at 61. I asked her what, precisely, frightened her about it. She thought for a long time, and then she said something I have kept ever since. She said, "If it is just the work people know, and something eventually goes wrong, it was the work that failed. If it is me they know, and something goes wrong, it will have been me." My darling Capricorns, that is the whole of the 8th house's demand on your sign, spoken plainly by a woman living directly inside it. The quiet anonymity had never simply been modesty. It had also been protection, a kind of insurance against ever being personally, visibly responsible for anything that might fail. She took the arrangement. The 18 months were, by her own account, genuinely difficult, considerably more exposing than she had prepared herself for. And she told me more than once during that period that she missed her old invisibility with an intensity that surprised her. The acquisition went through. The company is now, several years on, run under her name attached to its founding story, in a way that continues to generate work neither the original consultancy nor the acquiring company could have generated separately. She said to me, "Near the end of our work together, the merger was never really between the 2 companies. That part was just paperwork. The real merger was between the version of me that stayed safely behind the work and the version that finally let people see who had been doing it all along. I did not lose anything by becoming visible, in the end. I became considerably larger than the woman who was hiding, and I had not actually noticed, until it was over, how small that hiding had been keeping me." And she told me one more thing, which I want to give you exactly as she said it, because I think it is the most Capricorn sentence I have ever heard a client produce. She said, "I keep waiting to regret it, the way I regretted every other time I let myself be seen more than I meant to be. I have not yet. I think I finally picked a visibility large enough to actually be worth the discomfort of it, rather than the smaller, more casual kinds I always used to decline for not being worth the exposure." Pause with me for a moment. I know this has been a great deal. If this reading is bringing you something tonight, would you do me 3 small things? Like this video. It tells YouTube this matters to real people, and it carries it to somebody who has been quietly, safely hiding behind her own excellent work for considerably longer than Henrietta did. Subscribe and turn on the bell if you have not, because I make these readings for every sign and I intend to keep making them. And write to me in the comments. And I want the specific thing rather than the general thing. Tell me your sign, and tell me which ending is yours. The container, the unspoken understanding, the invisibility, the completed plan, or the need to be the singular source. And if you have been here a while, membership on this channel means readings reach you before they are published, and it means you and I actually speak in the comments, because I read member comments first, and I answer there more often and more personally than I am able to anywhere else. Now let me give you the practical part, because a structure is not a method, and I would rather leave you with something to actually do. There are 4 things, and they apply across all 5 of tonight's signs, whichever ending is yours. The first, name the ending precisely, in one sentence, rather than leaving it as a vague discomfort. Not, I am scared of change. The specific thing, I am afraid to be personally, publicly responsible for something that might fail. I am afraid that writing this down makes it real in a way I cannot take back. Precision is the beginning of being able to actually release something, because a vague fear can be avoided indefinitely, and a named one has to eventually be dealt with directly. The second, look for the merger already in front of you before assuming you need to go and find one. A great many of tonight's 5 are going to overlook an 8th house opportunity that has already been offered, because it did not arrive labeled as an opportunity. It arrived as a slightly uncomfortable condition attached to something else, the way Henrietta's acquisition arrived with a condition she almost let stop the entire arrangement. The third, do not merge with the first available partner simply because your sign is finally ready to let go of the old container. The 8th house asks you to release a boundary. It does not ask you to release your judgment about who or what is actually worth merging with. Henrietta did not sell to the first company that approached her. She sold to one whose terms she had genuinely examined, even as she wrestled with the personal condition attached to them. And the fourth, give the ending its own time before you expect the merger to feel like unambiguous good news. I told you earlier that grief and provision can arrive in the same envelope, and I meant that for the smaller endings as well as the larger ones. You are allowed to feel the loss of the old, safe, solo version of your situation for as long as that loss actually takes, even while the larger, merged version of it is visibly, materially improving your life in front of you. And a fifth, smaller than the other 4, which I want to add for practical reasons rather than astrological ones. Wherever real money is genuinely merging, a will, an equity stake, a joint account, an inheritance, involves somebody whose actual profession is protecting you inside that structure, a solicitor, an accountant, an advisor suited to the specific arrangement. My own reading tells you where the opportunity for merging is likely to appear and what you are being asked to release in order to meet it. It cannot tell you the correct terms of a contract, and I would rather send you to the right professional than let an hour of astrology stand in for one. Now, my darlings, let me give you the thing I have been building toward the whole of this hour. I said the same kind of thing at the end of every section tonight, in 5 different forms. Taurus, the ending is the small, safe container. Scorpio, the ending is the unspoken understanding. Capricorn, the ending is the comfortable invisibility. Virgo, the ending is the completed plan you always wait for. Leo, the ending is the need to be the singular, visible source. 5 different endings, my darlings, and I want you to notice that every single one of them is describing the same underlying shape, arriving through a different door. Here is the shape, and I think it is worth more to you than any figure I could have promised at the start of this reading. A richest era is never simply more. It is never your existing situation, left exactly as it was, with a larger number attached to the end of it. That is what a second house improvement looks like. A raise, a better rate, more of the same kind of thing you already have, and it is genuinely valuable, and it is not what tonight has been about. An 8th house wealth is arithmetic of an entirely different kind. It is not addition. It is merger. And a merger, by its actual definition, requires that 2 previously separate, complete things stop being separate and complete, and become, instead, one larger thing that is made of both and reducible to neither. You cannot merge and also remain, in every respect, exactly the solo configuration you were before. Something about that solo configuration has to end. Not because you failed at it, but because merging is structurally, mathematically incompatible with staying exactly the same size and shape you already were. That is why it so often arrives disguised as loss, my darlings. And I do not think that disguise is a cruelty. I think it is simply accurate. From inside the old solo configuration, its own conclusion genuinely does feel like an ending, because it is one. The crab does not experience its own crushing as a triumph while it is happening, and Henrietta did not experience 18 months of unwanted visibility as a gift while she was living through it. The larger thing on the other side of a merger is only visible from the other side of it, and you are, by definition, never standing there yet while you are deciding whether to allow the ending that leads to it. I want to give you one further piece of this, because I think it is the part that actually makes the whole reading usable, rather than simply comforting. Do you remember what I told Scorpio, the sign that owns this entire house by birthright, more than any other sign in the zodiac? Its own personal 8th house is governed not by intensity, not by depth, not by any of the qualities that make Scorpio Scorpio. It is governed by Mercury, by words spoken and written plainly. My darlings, I think that detail is the key to all 5 of tonight's readings, not only Scorpio's. Notice that in every single case, the planet governing each sign's 8th house is not simply more of what that sign already does well. Taurus, who values the tangible, is governed there by Jupiter, the untangible and expansive. Capricorn, who prefers the unseen, is governed there by the sun, which cannot help but be seen. Virgo, who completes the plan first, is governed there by Mars, which moves before the plan is finished. Leo, who is the singular source of everything, is governed there by Neptune, which dissolves the very idea of a single source. The 8th house, for every sign in this reading, and, I suspect, for every sign that did not make tonight's list as well, is never governed by your own strength doubled. It is governed by the exact quality sitting furthest from your natural instinct, which means the richest version of you was never going to be assembled purely out of more of what you already do brilliantly. It required the one thing you do not naturally reach for, merged with everything you already are, and that is a considerably larger and more interesting kind of wealth than simply being given a bigger pile of the same currency you already know how to count. You are not being asked to become a different person, my darlings. You are being asked to let the one quality you have always kept at arm's length finally merge with everything you already are, and to allow the smaller, safer, purely yourself version of your situation to end, so that the combined version has somewhere to actually exist. I want to leave you with one final image, because I think it will stay with you longer than the astrology alone. A single instrument, however beautifully made, produces only its own single sound, however long you play it, and however skilled you become at playing it. It was never going to become an orchestra by being practiced more. It becomes an orchestra by being placed, deliberately, next to instruments built entirely differently from itself, ones that sound nothing like it and were never meant to, and by allowing the sound that results to be something neither instrument could have produced, playing alone in an empty room for the rest of its existence. You have spent a very long time, my darlings, becoming an exceptional single instrument. Tonight I am telling you the orchestra is available, and that joining it was never going to diminish the sound you already make. It was only ever going to give it somewhere larger to be heard. My darlings, before I let you go, 3 small things. 1. If any part of this reading found you tonight, if you recognized your own ending in one of tonight's 5, if Henrietta's story about the visible and the safely hidden landed somewhere true, tap that like button. It is the simplest way to tell YouTube to carry this to somebody who is, right now, being offered a merger disguised as an uncomfortable condition attached to something else. 2. Subscribe and turn on the bell. I make these readings for every sign, and I make them so they can be found whenever somebody needs them, rather than only during a particular week. If you become a member, readings reach you before they are published, and you and I actually speak in the comments, because I read member comments first. 3, and this is the one I care about most. Which ending? That is all I am asking for. Not the story behind it, not the specific opportunity, simply which of the 5 it is for you. I read every single comment, truly, and I want to tell you why I am asking for so little. Because a comment section full of 40 women each naming her own ending, in a single honest word, is not a small thing, my darlings. It is a room full of people quietly admitting, at the same time, to the exact thing standing between them and something larger, and there is a considerable amount of comfort in discovering how many other people are standing at the edge of the same particular water. And if this reading gave you something and you ever want to say thank you more directly, A super thanks is never expected and always felt, and it is a genuine part of how I keep making these readings as carefully as I make them. If you know somebody who has been hiding safely behind her own excellent work, or holding an arrangement on trust alone, or waiting for a plan that will never quite finish completing, send this to her tonight. You may not realize how much a single share matters. It is how this work finds the person who needs it. Thank you, my darlings. This community has become something I genuinely did not expect when I began. These signs are entering their richest era. That is the title, and I believe it completely, and I want to close by telling you exactly what I mean by it, because it is not what you thought when this reading began. It does not mean a number is about to arrive that solves everything, all at once, without cost or complication. I have watched astrologers promise that for 35 years, and it has never once, in my experience, been the honest version of how real wealth of this kind actually moves. It means something in you, right now, tonight, is standing at the exact edge where a smaller, safer, entirely solo version of your situation is ready to end, and something considerably larger than that solo version is waiting on the other side of a merger you have not yet fully allowed. Taurus, through the risk you have always avoided. Scorpio, through the words you have always left unspoken. Capricorn, through the visibility you have always declined. Virgo, through the action you have always waited to be ready for. And Leo, my darling, through the surrender you have never fully offered anyone. Your richest era, my darlings, is not going to arrive because you finally did enough of what you already do well. It is going to arrive because you finally let the one thing you do not naturally reach for merge with everything you already are, and discovered, on the other side of that merging, that you had not disappeared at all. You had simply become considerably larger than the smaller thing that had to end first. I am Madame Aurora from Manhattan, and I love you, all 12 signs of the zodiac. I will see you in the next reading.